Beneath the official histories lies a second war, one fought in sealed bunkers, burned archives, and whispered orders. Here, victories were measured in secrets buried deeper than graves, and the dead were not always the ones in the ground. These are the shadows history tried to cauterize. But some wounds never close, and some truths refuse to stay silent. In March 1946, the Royal Navy's 30th Minesweeping Flotilla reported a sonar anomaly 28 nautical miles southeast of St. John's, Newfoundland. What was initially logged as an unidentified wreck became, within 48 hours, a classified salvage operation under the direct authority of the Admiralty's Directorate of Naval Intelligence. Officially, the recovered vessel was listed as U-1279, presumed lost in early 1945. In truth, the markings on the conning tower were inconsistent with Kriegsmarine records, and the logbooks found aboard made no mention of previous patrols. The crew, 23 men in total, were found still at their stations, their bodies intact but with skin shriveled to parchment from months in freezing brine. None bore signs of drowning. Beneath the forward torpedo racks, divers discovered a sealed lead-lined crate bolted to the deck. Its stenciled designation read Geheime Kommandosake, Nergugen Schriftlich Anweisung zu öffnen, indicating the highest level of Reich secrecy. According to the diver's report, the crate was so dense it required mechanical winching to bring aboard HMS Verulam. Within were tightly rolled engineering schematics, each sheet stamped with the emblem of the Waffenamt Prüfwesen, Weapons Testing Office, and the project code name Morgenrot. Several pages bore annotations in blue pencil, believed to be by Dr. Heinrich Brandt, a known naval weapons engineer last seen in Kiel in April 1945. Though the exact contents of the blueprints remain sealed, a surviving Royal Navy memorandum from April 12, 1946, declassified in 1998, makes passing reference to a compressed gas propulsion concept capable of extreme underwater acceleration and silent approach. The memo suggests the design exceeded anything in Allied service until at least the late 1950s. The lead engineer on the evaluation, Commander Alan Wakefield, submitted a technical brief that same month. No copy exists in public archives. Records indicate that on April 20, 1946, the crate and all associated materials were transferred by guarded convoy to RAF Spade Adam in Cumbria, then an experimental rocketry and propulsion site. Personnel rosters from that quarter show a sudden influx of civilian consultants from Vickers Armstrongs and Rolls-Royce. By October of that year, the names of every individual connected to the Morgenrot project, both naval and civilian, were redacted from payroll and service lists. None are traceable in later electoral rolls, service pension records, or obituaries. An unsigned MI6 field report dated February 2, 1948, and held in the National Archives under HS 9/317/2, hints at the possible fate of the technology. The report describes a special trials vessel tested off the coast of Anglesey in late 1947, capable of maneuvers inconsistent with standard hydrodynamic profiles. The trials were reportedly observed by 2 U.S. Navy attaches from the Office of Naval Research. The Americans, according to the same report, made a classified offer to acquire the prototype, which the British refused. Less than a month later, the facility at Spade Adam suffered a catastrophic fire, destroying several hangars. Official cause: electrical fault. No remains of the Morgenrot crate or its contents were ever found. Over the next 2 decades, scattered references to Morgenrot propulsion appear in otherwise unrelated NATO technical exchanges, always coded and often misfiled under meteorological or submersible research headings. One notable example is a 1963 Royal Canadian Navy memorandum on Arctic patrol capabilities, which lists silent approach, German configuration, as an option for classified polar operations. How the Canadians obtained such specifications is unknown. In 1971, former Petty Officer James Haldane, then terminally ill, gave a recorded interview to a BBC researcher working on a naval history program. The recording, partially released under the Freedom of Information Act in 2004, contains Haldane's recollection of the initial boarding of the U-boat. He claimed that before opening the lead crate, divers noticed a faint humming, like a turbine winding down, though the submarine had been submerged for months. Haldane further alleged that 2 of the divers developed severe neurological symptoms within days: memory loss, tremors, and unexplained disorientation, both later discharged as medically unfit. The BBC researchers' original tapes went missing after being submitted for fact-checking with the Ministry of Defence. An internal BBC memo from the time notes, "Maud has requested we omit all mention of the German propulsion unit from the broadcast." They cite national security concerns, which they admit are unusual for a subject over 25 years old. No mention of Projekt Morgenrot appears in standard histories of German naval development, nor in post-war interrogations of surviving Kriegsmarine officers. Dr. Heinrich Brandt's fate remains unresolved. Soviet records show he was not among those captured and relocated east for weapons research. His name, however, appears in a 1944 passenger manifest for a Luftwaffe courier flight from Piemont to Trondheim, its arrival date coinciding with the last known sighting of U-1279 in Norwegian waters. In 1989, a private diving expedition claimed to have located the wreckage of a small test submersible off Cumbria's coast, bearing an experimental propulsion nozzle unlike any standard British or German design. Within days, their salvage license was revoked by the Ministry of Defence, and the vessel was reportedly removed for environmental hazard assessment. It has not been displayed in any museum or naval collection. Today, the only publicly accessible material on Projekt Morgenrot consists of heavily redacted Admiralty memos, several blurred photographs of the recovered U-boat, and the faint traces it left in Cold War-era naval research documents. Whether the technology was ever perfected, or if its testing revealed risks too great to pursue, remains unknown. What is certain is that every surviving trace of it has been deliberately concealed, scattered, or destroyed over the course of nearly 8 decades, suggesting a truth not lost to history, but locked away by deliberate design. On February 17, 1949, at approximately 2:15 hours, a man in a worn red army greatcoat crossed through a disused service tunnel beneath the Berlin sector boundary, emerging into the British zone near Spandau. His name, as later recorded by MI5 field officers, was Colonel Sergei Mihailovich Voronov, formerly attached to the Soviet 8th Guards Army. Voronov was carrying a weathered leather briefcase, its straps reinforced with aircraft cable. When questioned by the British security detachment, he offered 2 statements: that he sought political asylum, and that the contents of the case proved the existence of a Japanese facility the Allies never found. Inside the briefcase were 12 black and white photographs, several rolls of undeveloped 35mm film, and 2 thin volumes of handwritten notes in a mix of Russian and Japanese. The photographs, taken at ground level and from low aerial altitude, depicted an isolated complex of reinforced concrete bunkers, barracks, and fenced compounds set in forested hills. The architecture bore Japanese military characteristics from the late Showa era, yet Voronov claimed the site was not in Japan at all, but in the interior of Honshu's less mapped mountain ranges near the Kuroshio current's origin, well beyond the range of standard Allied reconnaissance in 1945. Voronov identified the site as Facility E49, and alleged it had been operated by a covert branch of Unit 731 under direct orders from the Imperial General Headquarters. Its purpose, he said, was Type B human endurance trials, long-duration exposure to controlled environmental extremes, to study survival thresholds for troops intended for planned Arctic or subantarctic deployments. According to Voronov's account, when Japan surrendered in August 1945, Soviet forces, specifically the 25th Army advancing through northern Korea, intercepted a train carrying the site's senior staff, hundreds of photographic plates, and sealed canisters of chemical agents. The Soviets, instead of turning the personnel over to Allied war crimes investigators, transported them to a secure compound near Khabarovsk. The British intelligence assessment, declassified in part in 1983, notes that Voronov's description of the Khabarovsk facility aligns with the later verified Soviet use of captured Japanese bioweapons specialists. However, his claim that Facility E49 remained intact and under Soviet control was met with skepticism. MI6 cross-referenced aerial imagery from U.S. Army Air Force's late 1945 reconnaissance of Honshu. No such compound was identified. Voronov insisted the site was deliberately obscured under dense camouflage netting and smoke generators during daylight. Of particular interest in his briefcase were two photographs labeled, in Japanese kanji, Kuroshio specimens. The images showed what appeared to be human subjects, stripped to the waist, seated in steel-framed chairs with sensors affixed to their skin. Their faces were obscured, either intentionally or by photographic damage, but the background matched the concrete-walled interiors seen in other E-49 photographs. The accompanying notes described temperature-controlled immersion tanks, high-altitude simulation chambers, and experiments with rapid decompression, methods that, if accurate, would have violated every known wartime code of conduct. In March 1949, the Mi-5 interrogations of Voronov were interrupted when Soviet representatives formally demanded his return, citing allegations of treason and theft of state property. British authorities refused, but within weeks Voronov was moved to a safe house near Portsmouth. According to the surviving Home Office security logs, he remained under protection until April 12, when his assigned handlers discovered the safe house empty. No signs of forced entry were recorded, his personal effects and all photographic materials were gone. Decades later, a retired GCHQ signals officer revealed that, in May 1949, British listening stations intercepted a KGB transmission from Vladivostok referencing Projekt Shio no Kage, Tide Shadow, an internal codename believed to relate to Voronov's stolen materials. The transmission ordered containment of foreign breach and repatriation of subjects. No follow-up intercepts have been made public. U.S. military archives contain an obscure reference to Japanese cold endurance data, source undisclosed, in a 1951 report by the U.S. Air Force Arctic Test Branch. The report's authorship is unclear, but its methodologies bear striking similarities to Voronov's descriptions: prolonged exposure to sub-freezing conditions, immersion in near-freezing water, and measurement of cardiovascular response under oxygen-deprived environments. The data is cited as contributing to early USAF cold-weather flight suit designs. Russian state archives remain sealed on the matter, though in 1992, a short-lived period of openness allowed Japanese journalist Kenji Sato to access partial records from the Khabarovsk Military Tribunal. Among them was a transcript fragment mentioning transfer of Group B specialists to E-49 in late 1945. Sato's article, printed in a regional paper, was swiftly discredited by official channels, and the journalist died in an alleged road accident 6 months later. Today, the only surviving physical clue to the alleged facility E-49 is a single undeveloped film reel, preserved in the Imperial War Museum under accession number IWM 49/736, labeled simply Unknown Japanese Site. The museum's curators have never publicly confirmed whether the reel has been developed. Requests under the UK Freedom of Information Act to access the reel have been denied, citing international security implications. The fate of Voronov, the Kuroshio specimens, and the supposed facility deep in Honshu's wilderness remains unresolved. The absence of verifiable location data and the disappearance of primary witnesses has led some historians to dismiss the case as Cold War disinformation. Yet the overlap between Voronov's account and later emerging bioweapons trials in Soviet custody suggests a darker continuity, a chain of custody for war crimes evidence that was never meant to surface, buried as effectively as any battlefield grave. On April 14, 1953, an American officer seconded to the CIA's Special Operations Division was handed a sealed wooden crate by a former OSS contact in Munich. The source, a Bavarian antiques dealer with a history of discreet dealings in war relics, claimed the crate had been unearthed by workmen clearing the rubble of an abandoned Augustinian monastery near Füssen. The building, heavily damaged by Allied bombing in April 1945, had served in the final months of the war as a regional storage depot for Luftwaffe intelligence materials. Inside the crate were rolls of reconnaissance film, aerial maps, and logbooks, most of them routine documentation of bombing surveys across southern Europe. But one reel, marked Nur für Annenerbe, Sonderaufnahmen, stood out. It contained high-altitude imagery not of European cities, but of a remote section of the Syrian desert between Palmyra and Deir ez-Zor. The photographs revealed vast geometric patterns etched into the desert surface, concentric rings, intersecting lines, and angular formations stretching for kilometers. No military installations or known settlements appeared nearby. The geometric forms were visible only from altitude, suggesting intentional construction for aerial visibility. The logbook entry for the reel was dated March 3, 1944 and attributed to Staffelkapitän Otto Riedel, attached to Verknüpfungsgruppe 5, long-range reconnaissance group, operating out of Athens Tatwa airfield. The entry noted special directive from Annenerb HQ and mapping of energy lines, Energielinien, for future tests. The Annenerb, officially the Ancestral Heritage Research and Teaching Society, was an SS institute engaged in a range of pseudo-archaeological expeditions and, as post-war investigators learned, occasional collaboration with weapons research units. Upon arrival at CIA headquarters in Langley, the reels were assigned to a small evaluation team under cryptonym Blue ANKH. According to a surviving memorandum dated May 28, 1953, the Syrian images were compared with RAF wartime survey maps. The patterns did not appear on any British aerial reconnaissance, despite the RAF conducting numerous overflights in 1942–43. The memo notes structural regularity incompatible with natural erosion and recommends on-ground survey if politically feasible. No such survey is recorded in declassified files. 2 weeks later, the custodian assigned to Blue ANKH, a courier named Martin Claremont, was ordered to transport the Syrian reel and associated logbook to a CIA station in Paris for further evaluation. Claremont never arrived. His body was found 4 days later in a rented safehouse in the 17th arrondissement, the cause of death listed as probable myocardial infarction, despite his being 32 years old and in excellent health. The reel and logbook were missing. The safehouse inventory log, later recovered, shows signs of tampering, entries altered in a different hand and dates overwritten. French intelligence reportedly conducted a parallel investigation but shared no findings with their American counterparts. An internal CIA cable from Paris Station Chief Harold K. Brigham to Langley, dated June 19, 1953, warns of highly probable compromise and active Soviet interest in Blue ANKH subject matter. The cable also references an intercepted communication from the Soviet embassy in Damascus to Moscow Center mentioning German film material and archaeometric survey. By 1957, fragments of the missing imagery surfaced in an unexpected place. An article in the Soviet scientific journal Izvestia and SSSR showing aerial photographs of geometric desert patterns as part of a paper on ancient water distribution systems. The photographs were unattributed, and their resemblance to the missing Luftwaffe images was noted by Western analysts. The published article, however, omitted several of the more complex formations seen in the original reel. In 1968, a retired Luftwaffe intelligence officer named Hans Keller, interviewed in Hamburg by a West German television crew, recalled being briefed on Middle Eastern mapping flights that were not about oil or fortifications. Keller claimed the patterns in the Syrian desert were linked to research into atmospheric energy collection, a speculative technology the Reich hoped could power long-range radar or weapon systems without fixed power stations. His claims were never corroborated. By the mid-1970s, references to Blue ANKH had been scrubbed from CIA internal indexes, replaced with generic file headings under Foreign Geodetic Surveys. Freedom of Information Act requests for the project return no responsive records. The Bavarian source who originally passed the crate to the OSS contact was killed in an unsolved burglary in 1978. The only items missing from his shop were pre-war Leica cameras and photographic plates. Today, the location of the full Luftwaffe reel remains unknown. The Syrian desert patterns, while occasionally photographed by modern satellites, have largely been dismissed by archaeologists as ancient geoglyphs or abandoned agricultural layouts. Yet the precision of their geometry, and their documented connection to an SS unit notorious for blending archaeology with covert technology research, has kept the file alive in certain classified circles. The question remains whether the images recorded something lost to time, or a deliberate wartime experiment whose purpose has yet to be revealed. On July 12, 1945, U.S. Navy Signals Intelligence at Station HYPO in Hawaii intercepted a series of encrypted transmissions between Kure Naval Base and the Imperial Japanese Navy's Submarine Division headquarters. The decrypted fragments referred to Hakuryū deployment readiness and final fitting of aircraft hangar modules. Analysts quickly connected these messages to persistent Allied fears that Japan had developed a prototype I-400 class submarine carrier capable of launching bomber strikes on the U.S. mainland. Naval planners believed the vessel, if completed, could carry up to 3 Aichi M6A1 Syrian floatplanes, each armed for strategic bombing. Intelligence estimates suggested the submarine could surface off the Pacific Northwest, launch its aircraft, and submerge before radar detection. However, by the time of Japan's surrender in August 1945, U.S. occupation forces reported no surviving examples of such a vessel in operational condition. The official record states the incomplete hulls at Hakuryū were destroyed in dockyard air raids. In 1961, the narrative began to shift. A classified U.S. Navy report, obtained years later through heavily redacted Freedom of Information releases, described a sighting by the crew of the Alaskan fishing trawler St. Elias Star on September 17, 1961. Approximately 40 nautical miles south of Attu Island, they reported an unmarked submarine breaking the surface. It was unusually wide-beamed, with what appeared to be a sealed hangar structure on its forward deck. The vessel remained surfaced for less than 10 minutes before submerging without running lights. Upon returning to port in Dutch Harbor, the St. Elias Star crew found U.S. Navy intelligence officers waiting. The men were interrogated individually, their fishing logs and navigation charts seized. 2 days later, the trawler was officially chartered by the Navy for an undisclosed hydrographic survey. When it returned to civilian use 3 months later, all radar and sonar equipment had been replaced. The Navy report assigns the incident the internal project name, Sea Dragon, noting that sonar buoys were deployed across the Aleutian chain in the following months. No further sightings were officially recorded, but acoustic analysis logs from SOSUS, Sound Surveillance System, arrays in the North Pacific contain anomalies matching the submerged displacement of an I-400 class hull, registered intermittently between 1962 and 1965, always in remote waters north of the Kuril Islands. Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, JMSDF, archives hold a curious entry from 1963, a joint JMSDF-US Navy exercise labeled Operation North Current was abruptly cancelled due to unforeseen navigational hazards. JMSDF veterans interviewed decades later recalled that the hazard was, in fact, the detection of an unauthorized submarine in restricted waters, its silhouette matching neither Soviet nor American designs. By 1974, Sea Dragon references in U.S. Navy files were replaced with the nondescript heading, Oceanographic Vessel Studies. This reclassification coincided with the construction of several deep-diving submersibles for cable-laying and intelligence-gathering purposes, prompting speculation that any surviving Hakuryū-class vessel had been salvaged or secretly studied. One of the few public leaks came in 1982, when a retired electronics technician from Naval Facility ADAC spoke to an Anchorage journalist. He claimed that during his service in the early 1960s, a classified order instructed all stations to treat contacts exceeding 8,000 tons submerged displacement as Soviet. The technician noted this weight matched no known Soviet submarine of the era, but did match projections for a fully loaded Hakuryū type. The fisherman who first reported the 1961 sighting, a man named Walter Graham, gave a taped interview in 1985. He described the submarine's hull as the color of wet slate, no markings, and a strange flat deck ahead of the sail. Graham died 2 years later. His tapes were reportedly purchased at auction by an unknown buyer. Today, Operation Hakuryū is absent from both Japanese and American official wartime histories. No confirmed photographs exist of a completed Hakuryū-class submarine. The absence of wreckage in known scuttling locations, the unexplained Aleutian sightings, and the enduring classification of Sea Dragon files suggest either that a single prototype escaped destruction in 1945, or that it was quietly taken into custody by a post-war power, its existence hidden in the cold depths of the North Pacific. In January 1944, Abwehr intercept stations in neutral Switzerland recorded an unusual spike in encrypted Wehrmacht radio traffic referencing a codename previously unseen, Felswerk 12. The transmissions originated in the eastern Carpathians near the Romanian border. Allied codebreakers initially assumed it to be a hardened command post. Later decrypted fragments mentioned Wettersteuerung, weather control, atmospheric excitation arrays, and delivery readiness for Operation Donnerschlag. The information was logged, then buried under competing intelligence priorities as the Eastern Front collapsed. The first direct Allied report came from Romanian partisans in September 1944, who described trains entering a mountain tunnel near the town of Visu de Sus. The rolling stock was heavily guarded by Waffen-SS personnel and carried crated machinery marked with the sigil of the Reichsluftfahrtministerium, German Air Ministry. Locals noted that above the valley, lightning storms were unnaturally frequent, often lasting for hours without rain. The phenomenon ceased abruptly after Soviet troops began their push through the region in early 1945. Soviet archives, opened briefly in the 1990s, contain a field report from the 18th Guards Rifle Division dated March 11, 1945. The report details the capture of a hardened underground facility carved into metamorphic rock, accessible only through a rail tunnel sealed by steel blast doors. Inside, Red Army troops found rows of dismantled generators, copper coil arrays, and heavy transformers. Several floors were flooded due to demolished bulkheads, and the upper galleries bore signs of explosive charges placed with precision. No personnel were captured. Recovered documents, according to the same report, referenced ionosphere stimulation and aerosol dispersal apparatus. Technical blueprints bore the signature of Dr. Klaus Reichenbach, an engineer associated with pre-war high-voltage research at AEG in Berlin. Reichenbach vanished in April 1945 and does not appear in post-war denazification lists. Soviet engineers dismantled what remained of the site, shipping select components to Leningrad for study. The remainder was destroyed with shaped charges, collapsing the tunnels. In 1958, East German meteorologist Hans Lutz gave a private statement to a visiting West German colleague, claiming he had seen Felswerk 12 machinery stored in a Leningrad military research facility during a professional exchange. He described coil stacks the height of a man, and conductors insulated with unusual ceramic composite. Lutz's comments were dismissed as fabrication until his unexplained disappearance from a scientific conference in Vienna in 1961. Austrian police records note that his hotel room showed no signs of forced entry, and his travel documents were left behind. Satellite imagery declassified by the U.S. National Reconnaissance Office in 2005 shows the Visu de Sus Valley in 1968, 2 decades after the supposed destruction of the site. The imagery reveals large rectangular clearings and unusual linear soil discolorations consistent with buried conduit trenches. No official explanation accompanies the photographs. Among the few surviving physical artifacts linked to Felswerk 12 is a corroded steel placard discovered in 1984 by a caver exploring an abandoned tunnel near the original site. The placard, preserved in a private collection, bears the embossed Reichsadler and the text, Felswerk 12, ABT, for Stratosphärische Versuche, Department for Stratospheric Experiments. Metallurgical analysis indicated alloys uncommon in civilian manufacturing at the time. A 1977 West German intelligence memo, partially declassified in 2012, speculated that the purpose of Felswerk May 12 had been defensive, creating localized storms to hinder Allied bomber formations. However, an alternative hypothesis in the same memo suggested offensive capability, disruption of enemy communications via atmospheric ionization. The memo concludes with the notation, "Objective remains technically unverified. Soviet retention of related technology probable." Today, the original mountain tunnel is sealed behind reinforced concrete poured by Romanian authorities in the early 1980s, officially to prevent collapses. Local residents continue to report unusual static interference on radios during certain weather conditions, particularly in the spring. No official investigation has been undertaken, and the story of Felswerk 12 remains confined to fragments of declassified intelligence, uncorroborated witness accounts, and the occasional unexplained flicker in the Carpathian storms. We walk away thinking the past is finished, boxed in and labeled. Yet under every archive lies a locked drawer, under every monument a whisper of what was erased. The ghosts of these operations do not fade, they wait. And the deeper you look, the more you realize, it's not the dead who haunt us. It's the living secrets they left behind.